Peter and HisSword again for phase 2 of my AR pistol build. Diving right into it, I'll be showing you how I built my lower receiver. I will also have a list of all the tools needed to complete your lower receiver build in the description below. I'll be starting with the magazine kit. First off, grab your mag release and insert it from the left hand side of the receiver. Then drop the mag release spring over the threaded portion, then screw on the mag release button, giving it a few turns. After, you can use a punch, or like I use the drill bit, to depress the mag button into the receiver, allowing you to rotate the mag release itself, thus tightening the button to the threaded portion of the mag release. Then of course you function check it and move on. Now it's time to drop in the trigger assembly. Drop the trigger assembly into the receiver, applying just enough pressure to line up the slot in the trigger assembly with the slot in the receiver, and drive the pin through. At this point, no hammering should be needed once the right amount of pressure is applied on the assembly while installing the pin. Next, you're going to grab your trigger hammer. Note that the hoop on the spring should sit on the back side of your hammer. An easy test is to place the hammer on the table, hold the spring legs down, and if the tension causing a hammer action, you're good. When inserting the hammer into the receiver, be sure that the flat side of the hammer's head is facing the mag well of the receiver. It's a little tricky depressing the hammer into the receiver. As you can see, I use my punch as a guide to hold the hammer in position to install the hammer pin, which worked in my favor. Then quick function check, just like the mag release, and you're good to go. Next, we'll be installing the safety selector switch and the pistol grip. First things first is let's make sure that we're grabbing the right set of springs. The thicker spring is what we're looking for. The other is one of two springs for the takedown pins that we're going to need for later, so don't put them too far. Go ahead and drop in the selector switch into the selector switch slot and the detent pin into the hole behind the trigger guard. The spring into the grip and install as shown. Next, grab the screw provided with your grip, and we're going to torque that down being careful not to strip out the pistol grip itself. After finishing up our ambidextrous selector switch, grab the small screw and torque it down with the lever given. Again, quick function check and move on. Next, we'll be installing the takedown pin and the pivot pin. For this install, I recommend using a lower receiver vise block. Then we can start by inserting the pivot pin spring, following it with the detent. After that, I use an Allen key to hold the detent in place while the pivot pin is installed. Also have a few photos on here just taken that gives you a better understanding of what and where the parts are being installed. Now it's time to move on to the pistol buffer tube and buffer spring. Still working on setting the detent and the spring into the rear of the lower receiver. Now you want to grab your pistol buffer tube, buffer spring, and buffer weight. Next, start by inserting the tube into the housing. Make sure that when you're screwing the buffer tube into the receiver, you remember to keep an eye out to make sure that the buffer detent spring is depressed. Then grab your armorer's wrench. It's really important to make sure that when you're screwing in the buffer tube into the lower receiver, that you make sure that that buffer tube detent is depressed and it's barely captured by the buffer tube itself. Next, you're going to want to torque down that buffer tube to your lower receiver with 40 foot-pounds. It's not needed, but it's recommended. Now it's time to just install the buffer weight and buffer spring. Make sure that you pin down the buffer detent and push the buffer spring to the back of the buffer tube. Release the detent and it'll hold everything in place. Last but not least, it's time to install the bolt catch. Insert the bolt catch spring and detent. Then depending on how your bolt catch detent sits in your receiver determines on how you install it. Some are hammered into place and some are screwed. It just depends on the lower receiver that's bought. After, we do a tiny function check, and we're ready to go. Please take the time to like, share, and subscribe if you've liked what you've seen today. Thanks.